Welcome to Wild West Love Chronicles. Today I'm going to share a deeply touching and thrilling story, so let's listen closely and enjoy every moment. The moon rose pale over the desert, casting long shadows across the crimson rock. The coyotes hadn't started singing yet, and the wind was still, like the land was holding its breath. In the heart of that stillness, a girl walked barefoot across the dry earth, her black braid trailing behind her like a ribbon of ink. Her name was Nita, and she belonged to the people of the mountains, but not one soul in her village would claim her with pride. Her face, on the right side, bore a mark, dark and shaped like the wing of a great bird. It stretched from her temple down across her cheek, softening as it reached her jaw. The elders called it a shadow from the spirit world. Some said it meant she had been touched by an owl before birth, an omen of death. Her mother used to whisper that it was a blessing, that the owl was not a curse but a messenger between worlds. But her mother had died in the third winter after giving birth, and since then, the whispers had only grown louder. She was 13 now, too old to chase the other children, too young to speak freely in council, and just visible enough to carry the weight of people's fears. They didn't hit her, or yell, or throw stones. No, it was worse than that. They looked through her. They passed her by. And when her shadow touched theirs at the fire, they moved away. So she walked in silence. Past the outer fire pits, past the elder women who ground maize and traded beads, past the boys practicing with spears, and up the ridge where the wind curled around the rocks like a spirit waiting to be heard. This was the only place where the world felt like it belonged to her. She sat beneath a juniper tree that clung to life with twisted roots and listened. The earth spoke here, not with words, but in creaks and rustles, in the soft scratch of a beetle's legs or the hum of nightbirds turning on their branches. Nita leaned back and closed her eyes. If she listened long enough, she could almost hear her mother's voice. "You see with more than your eyes, little owl," she had said once. "You hear things others cannot." It was true, in a way. Nita knew the way plants whispered in the wind. She knew which cactus held water, which flower's roots could stop a fever. She could touch a bruised animal and feel where the pain lived, like it whispered into her palms. But none of that mattered in the village. Healing hands or not, she bore the mark. And so they called her owl-cursed when they thought she couldn't hear. She always did. A soft sound reached her now, too soft for any of the louder animals. It was low, pained, sharp. She turned her head and stood, stepping carefully through the brush. Not 50 paces from where she'd been sitting, half hidden in the rocks, a small coyote lay with its leg caught in a rusted trap. Blood darkened the sand beneath it. Nita knelt slowly. The animal growled, teeth bared, but its body shook from pain and exhaustion. "I won't hurt you," she said gently. "I promise." She reached into the pouch at her hip and took out a leather-wrapped bundle. Inside were crushed leaves, softened bark, a small pot of sticky sap, and a curved bone knife. She moved with care, talking in a low voice the whole time, not because the coyote understood her words, but because her tone said what words could not. When she pried open the trap, the coyote lunged, then collapsed. Nita worked quickly, binding the wound with salve and moss padding, then wrapping it with a strip of her own tunic. When she was done, she sat beside the creature and waited. And high on the other ridge, watching from the shadows of a dead pine, an old man sat atop his horse. Thomas Granger hadn't planned to come out tonight. He rarely did anything on purpose these days. At 68, he'd done most of the living he planned to, and the rest he met with quiet resistance. He had a ranch that used to be proud, now with fences falling and a roof that leaked worse than a preacher's promise. His horse, Smoke, was older than some of the boys who tried to steal from his fields, and he was alone, had been for 15 years, ever since his wife had gone cold and quiet in her sleep, and the cholera had taken his son before the first spring rains. So he rode sometimes, mostly to remind himself the world still turned. Tonight the horse had taken him farther west than usual, toward the mesas where the land felt ancient. He dismounted to stretch his knees when he saw movement below. At first, he thought it was a boy, but the way she moved, the dark braid, the hands working steady and quick, it became clear this was a girl. And she wasn't just watching the animal, she was fixing it. Thomas narrowed his eyes. Apache, by the look. He didn't have quarrel with the tribes around here. He stayed out of their way, and they stayed out of his. But he'd never seen one this young alone, and never one doing what she was doing now. He watched in silence, not for sport, but because something in the scene refused to let him look away. The girl's face turned toward the moonlight once, and he caught the mark. Even from here, it was visible, strange, dark, not a scar, almost like paint that wouldn't wash away. When the girl finally stood, the coyote limped beside her, favoring its leg. She gave it a look, then pointed her finger west, away from the village. The animal paused, then slowly padded off into the dark. Thomas exhaled. He didn't make a sound, not yet. He wasn't sure if he wanted to approach or ride away and pretend he'd seen nothing. But smoke shifted beneath him and knocked a stone loose. It rolled down the slope. Nita turned sharply. Her hand went to her belt. She didn't carry a weapon, but her fingers closed around a stone anyway. "Who's there?" she called. Her voice was not afraid, just firm. Thomas rode out of the shadows slowly, one hand lifted. "Don't throw it," he said. "I'm not looking for trouble." She narrowed her eyes. Her stance didn't relax. "You were watching." "Only a minute," he said, stopping his horse a few paces off. "Didn't expect to see anyone this far out." "Then leave," she said. He nodded once. "Fair enough." He turned Smoke to go, then hesitated. Glanced back over his shoulder. "You did good with that animal. Leg was near snapped, but it'll walk again." She said nothing. "You learned that from someone?" "My grandmother," she said. "She's dead." Thomas nodded again. "Well, she'd be proud, I reckon." She looked away, and he turned his horse back toward the trail. He didn't expect anything else. Didn't want it, really. Just curiosity, that's all. But as he started down the path, her voice came softly behind him. "What's your name?" He stopped. "Thomas. Granger. You?" "Nita." He tipped his hat without turning. "Safe travels, Nita." She didn't answer. By the time he looked back, she was already gone, vanished into the rocks like a desert spirit. Thomas rode on through the night, his mind unsettled. Not in a bad way, but in the way a man feels when something old inside him shifts without permission. He'd seen medicine women before. He'd watched old grandmothers treat snake bites with smoke and leaves. But he'd never seen a child so steady or eyes so sharp. Back in his cabin, he poured a bit of whiskey, stared at the empty chair across the table, and whispered into the silence, "Reckon I met someone strange tonight, Mary." And out on the ridge, beneath the juniper tree, Nita sat again with her legs tucked beneath her and her hands stained with blood and sap. The wind had picked up, and the coyotes were singing now, distant but clear. She listened for their song, but it was not the only thing she heard. Somewhere, deep in her chest, something had shifted too. The stars blinked overhead, and, somewhere in the dark, an owl called. The sun rose hot over the desert, burning away the chill of the night like it had something to prove. Dust hung in the air before the heat had even fully woken, and the wind carried with it the smell of creosote and sun-baked rock. In the shallow canyon near the ridge, Nita crouched low, watching the coyote from the night before limp along the dry riverbed. Its legs still wrapped in moss and cloth, it moved cautiously but with purpose. She smiled faintly, then turned away. Her work was done. By the time she made it back near the village's outer edge, the sun was full overhead. She stayed to the shadows, slipping behind rock outcroppings and clusters of brush, not out of fear, but habit. It was easier not to be seen. If they didn't see her, they wouldn't whisper. If they didn't whisper, she wouldn't have to hear the names again. She passed the small corral, where boys were roping sticks in the dirt and pretending they were warriors. They paused when she neared, then snickered and made a half circle around her. One of them called out, "Don't let her shadow touch you. It'll stick to your soul." Another held up 2 fingers to mimic owl wings and hooted mockingly. Nita kept walking, her jaw clenched, her steps steady. She didn't throw a rock. She didn't spit. She'd learned long ago that their words had less power if she gave them nothing back. She found her way to the far edge of the camp where her grandmother's old shelter still stood, long abandoned, the hide door worn thin and the roof half sagging. She stepped inside and sat cross-legged on the woven mat, where she used to learn about roots and remedies, and how to tell the difference between medicine and poison. From under a stone near the wall, she pulled out her pouch of herbs and powders, then laid them out in rows. The red root, the dried sage, the snakeweed. She ran her fingers along them, her breath slowing. The memory came, sharp and clear, her grandmother's voice. "The earth holds everything we need, Nita. It will give if you ask kindly. But you must always give back. Never take without gratitude." She closed her eyes and whispered a soft chant. Not because it was required, but because it helped her feel close to something greater than herself. The gods of the land, the sky, the bones of the mountain, they didn't care about the mark on her face. They had never turned their backs. A soft thud sounded outside the shelter. Her hand went to her belt, fingers closing around a curved flint shard. She crept to the edge and peeked out. A folded cloth pouch sat on the ground. Inside, dried jerky and a small loaf of cornbread. No footsteps, no voice, no note. But she already knew who left it. She stood silently for a moment, scanning the horizon. Then she scooped up the food, walked out of the shelter, and climbed the ridge trail back toward the high rocks where the wind carved through the stone like old stories. It was the place she always went when she wanted to feel untouched by people. But lately, it was becoming something else. Thomas Granger stood near the edge of the ridge, reins in one hand, the other scratching Smoke's neck absently. He didn't look surprised when she appeared. He just glanced her way, gave a slight nod, and said, "Didn't want to see you starve." Nita dropped the pouch at her feet. "I'm not your stray dog." "Didn't say you were," he replied, not unkindly. "Just figured even wild things need something in their belly." She didn't move to pick it back up. She looked at him, the deep lines of his face, the weathered coat, the way he stood like someone used to being alone. "You don't talk like the others," she said. "That's so? They always look at me like I'm dangerous." He gave a one-shouldered shrug. "You probably are, just not in the way they think." Nita tilted her head slightly. That wasn't a compliment. But it wasn't an insult either. She sat down on the flat stone behind her. He stayed standing. "Why are you out here?" she asked. He glanced at the sky. "Same reason as you, I'd reckon. World's too loud where the people are." That made her smile, just a little. Only for a second. Thomas took off his hat, scratched at his scalp, and looked off toward the horizon. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. She frowned. "Leaving where?" "Your village. This place." "I don't belong anywhere else," she said. "Don't sound like you belong there, either." She was quiet a moment. Then, almost too softly to hear, "There's nowhere left to go." He looked down at her, something like recognition passing through his expression. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "There's always somewhere. Might be broken, might be old, but it's still somewhere." She looked up at him, her voice steady, but with a flicker of challenge. "Is your ranch that somewhere?" He didn't answer right away. "It's a place," he said finally. "Not much more than that. Roof leaks, barn sags. Fence is more memory than wood. But it stands." Smoke pawed the dirt, and Thomas clicked his tongue gently. "Come by if you need water. I got a well that don't judge faces." He mounted the horse, nodded again, and rode down the ridge trail. Nita watched until the dust settled. She stayed there until the sun dropped behind the canyon, then returned to the shelter and laid awake, her mind turning like leaves in a restless stream. 3 days passed. She didn't see him again. Then came the storm. It wasn't a loud one, not at first. The sky just darkened in a way that made the elders start moving faster, tying down tents and whispering to the wind spirits. The clouds rolled in over the cliffs with that strange kind of silence that, only happens before something wild breaks loose. Nita had been out gathering wild garlic root near the dry wash. She was about to turn back when the wind shifted and the sky cracked wide open. Rain came down hard and fast. The canyon filled in moments. She tried to follow the trail back, but the water rose quicker than she'd seen before. The creek that was dry a moment ago was now a river. The path she came down was mud and stone and chaos. She climbed higher, tried circling back, but a ledge crumbled under her feet, and she landed hard against a rock, twisting her ankle. The pain was sharp. She couldn't walk fast, maybe not at all. The rain didn't stop. She pulled herself under a stone ledge, curled up against the cold, and waited. Night came. She bit down on a strip of jerky she'd saved from the pouch, her only food. Her ankle throbbed like fire. She closed her eyes, whispered a chant to the land, like her grandmother taught. But no help came, until morning. She didn't hear the hoofbeats until they were almost on her. Smoke's nose nudged her side gently, and she startled awake, hand flying to her pouch. Thomas sat in the saddle, soaked through but calm. "You always sleep in riverbeds?" he asked. She looked at him, dazed. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you." "Why?" "Because it's raining." She stared at him a moment longer, then laughed. Not a loud laugh, but real. Rough from her throat. He dismounted, looked at her ankle. "Can you stand?" No. He didn't ask more. Just crouched down, and, with a grunt, hoisted her up like she weighed little more than smoke. "Put your arms around my neck," he said. "You fall, I'll drop you on a cactus." She did, as she was told. Smoke took them slow over the ridge, water still dripping from every surface, the air thick and fresh. When they reached the ranch, the barn leaned even worse than he'd said. The house was small and tired-looking, and weeds ruled the yard. But the well water was clear, the fireplace warm, and the roof, while it groaned, held against the wind. Thomas sat her in a chair near the fire and handed her a blanket. Then he knelt and examined her ankle again. "You got anything in that pouch for swelling?" he asked. She blinked. "You believe in my herbs? I saw you fix a coyote's leg. I reckon a girl who can do that can patch herself." She pulled out crushed bark and some wrapped cactus pulp. "Mix this with water," she said. "Soak cloth in it. Then wrap it tight." He did just that. As he wrapped her ankle, he didn't speak. His hands were rough, but careful. When he finished, she looked around the cabin. There were old photographs on the wall, faded, but still clinging to memory. A woman with long hair, a young boy with a wooden toy horse. "Your family?" she asked. He nodded. "Gone," he said simply. She didn't ask how. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded again. "I don't get visitors much," he said. "I don't get invited much," she replied. They sat in silence a long time, just the fire crackling and the wind testing the windows. Eventually, Thomas stood. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow, I'll take you back." She nodded. "I'll sleep here," he said, pointing to the floor. "Ain't much difference from a saddle blanket." She didn't argue. As the fire dimmed, she looked into the flames and whispered another chant, soft, almost a lullaby. Thomas listened, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't mind the sound of another person's voice in his house. Outside, the rain stopped. And somewhere in the desert, another owl called. The sun rose over the horizon like a slow spilling fire, gilding the ranch in gold. Mist clung to the scrub brush, and the dew glittered on broken fence posts like little stars refusing to fade. The land still smelled of wet wood and sage after the storm, a rare freshness that made everything feel briefly new. But it didn't change the fact that the barn still leaned, the paint still peeled, and Thomas Granger's house still creaked under its own bones. Inside that tired cabin, Nita stirred. She'd slept deeply, more deeply than she had in weeks. Maybe it was the warmth from the fire. Maybe it was the silence that wasn't judgmental or cruel. Or maybe, for once, it was just the absence of whispers. She blinked at the ceiling, rough-hewn and darkened with smoke. Her ankle throbbed, but less than the day before. When she sat up, the blanket fell from her shoulder, and she caught sight of Thomas sitting in a rocking chair near the window, whittling something with a dull knife. He didn't look over. "Storm's done with its tantrum," he said. "Creek's still swollen, but the roads'll dry." She nodded, adjusting the blanket. "You didn't sleep." I dozed. "You carve often?" "Gives my hands something to do. Keeps the ghosts quiet." Nita studied the figure in his hands, a rough little horse. Its legs were too thick, and the head leaned funny, but it held something honest in its shape. "It's ugly," she said. Thomas snorted. "So am I." She smiled and swung her legs off the cot. The floor was cold beneath her bare feet, but it felt real, sturdy. The way things should feel when they're not lying to you. Outside, smoke snorted in the paddock. A pair of sparrows danced on the fence rail. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded. "Starving." He stood with a grunt and went to the stove. The eggs he cracked were speckled, the bacon thin and curling, but it was more food than she'd eaten in a week. They sat at the table without ceremony, chewing in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Afterward, Nita cleaned the dishes without being asked. She moved slowly, her ankle stiff, but refused the chair he offered her twice. "You always cook alone?" she asked. "Not always," he said. She paused. "Your wife?" "Mary," he said. "She liked mornings, hated bacon. She died." He nodded. "Long time ago." She didn't push. Later, he helped her limp out to the front step. The world beyond the porch was soft with light, the kind that made even old dirt look forgiving. "I'll take you back this afternoon," he said. Nita looked out over the dry fields. "You don't have to." He glanced at her. "Thought you said you didn't belong anywhere else." She exhaled. "I said I didn't know where else there was. That doesn't mean I wanted to go back." He nodded slowly. "You can stay a few days if you like. Till the swelling's down." She didn't answer, but her shoulders relaxed a little. It was enough. That afternoon, Thomas showed her the barn. It leaned like a drunk on one leg, the boards grayed and sun-split, the loft half-rotted. But it stood. He told her where the water pump was, where the chicken coop used to be, and where the garden had died 3 summers ago. "I used to grow beans," he said. "Corn, too." Mary had a way with squash. She said plants grow better if you talk to them. "Your plants died?" "They stopped listening." Nita ran her fingers through the dry soil near the edge of the garden plot. She sniffed it, rubbed it between her palms. Then she stood and walked to the shed. Inside, everything smelled like rust and old leather, but among the broken tools and dust-covered jars, she found what she needed: an old sack of seeds, some twine, and a rusted hoe with enough edge left to matter. She came out holding them. "Let's see if your dirt still remembers how to listen." He blinked, then gave a short laugh. "You're serious? Do you want a dead ranch?" He tilted his head. "I got one already." "Then let's wake it up." And so they did. The next 3 days passed in a rhythm neither of them expected. Nita, barefoot in the field, walking rows into the dry ground. Thomas, bent over fence posts, hammering nails with a kind of stubborn dignity. He taught her how to mend chicken wire and how to set a trap without losing a finger. She showed him how to steep willow bark to ease his aching knees. They didn't talk about their pasts, not directly, but the way they moved together, the way they worked side by side without stepping on each other's shadows. It was enough. But peace in the desert never lasts forever. On the 4th morning, Thomas rode into town. He didn't go often, just when the feed ran low or something needed fixing. He wasn't 2 steps through the door of the general store when he felt the air shift. The man behind the counter, Dawson, nodded stiffly. "Granger?" Dawson. A couple of younger men near the crates of nails turned to look. One nudged the other, whispered. Thomas ignored it, bought his oats, salt, and a bag of flour. But as he turned to leave, Dawson cleared his throat. "Heard you got company out there," he said casually. Thomas paused. "That so?" "Apache girl, ain't it?" Thomas turned. His eyes were quiet, but sharp. "She's not hurting anyone." "She yours?" Thomas stared. She's a guest. Dawson nodded slowly. Lot of folks ain't happy, Granger. Town's already tight. Folks think you're harboring something. I ain't harboring anything but a sprained ankle and a half-dead ranch. Dawson leaned in. People talk, Thomas. Some say she's cursed, marked. That girl's not just any child. I know exactly what she is, Thomas said coldly. She's more use than half the men in this town. He left without waiting for change. Word spread fast in small towns. By the time Thomas returned to the ranch, the wind had already shifted. 2 nights later, while he and Nita were cleaning out the barn loft, a stone crashed through the window. Then another. A smear of ash across the door spelled one word. Witch. Nita stood frozen, her hands clenched. Her shoulders didn't shake, but her eyes were hollow. Thomas walked out onto the porch, rifle in hand. But there was no one left, just tire tracks and dust. A warning sent and received. That night, Nita didn't sleep. She sat on the porch, her back straight, the firelight glinting off the birthmark on her face. Thomas joined her near midnight, handed her a cup of coffee she didn't drink. "They'll come back," she said. "Maybe. You should send me away." He didn't look at her. "You planning on going?" She was silent. "I can't stop what people say," he said, "but I can control who I believe." She looked at him then. "Why do you believe me?" "Because I've seen what you are," he said. "And what you ain't." She held his gaze a long time, then nodded, but something had changed in her. A wall built overnight, quiet and high. The next day, Thomas found her bag packed. Her herbs, her pouch, her flint knife. She didn't say goodbye. Just left before the sun had finished rising, he called her name. Once, twice. She didn't turn around, just kept walking into the desert. And he stood there, watching her vanish into the dust. The house behind him suddenly felt colder than it ever had before. The desert swallowed her. Nita walked long before the sun had fully crested the mesas, her braid damp with morning sweat, her pouch thumping lightly against her hip. The sky was pale blue, edged with orange where the last of night's shadows clung to the rocks. Her boots were light, almost silent against the cracked red earth. She carried nothing but water, herbs, a knife, and the hollow ache of knowing she had once again become a burden. The ranch had given her peace, and now it too would carry the stain of her presence. The stones through the windows, the names scrawled in ash. Witch. Those weren't just warnings, they were promises. She would not let Thomas Granger pay the price for giving her a roof. He had given her kindness, and that was rare enough. But even kindness, she had learned, came with weight. And so she walked into the canyons that once held her secrets, toward the place where she had always gone when the world had no room left for her. The wind picked up by midday, carrying dust and seed pods through the dry gullies. Ravens circled overhead. She passed the remains of an old wagon wheel buried in the sand, then followed a coyote trail until she reached the ridge where the rock bent in strange wind-carved shapes. The place her grandmother once called sacred. Nita sat with her back against a boulder, breath slow, ankle throbbing again. She didn't cry. She hadn't in years. Even when the village women turned their backs, even when her aunt refused to look at her during morning rituals. Crying did nothing in a land that never gave anything for free. Still, there was a weight in her chest now, sharper than before. Not just loneliness, but something else. Something that felt like regret. She didn't regret leaving. But she hated that leaving felt like tearing a root out of ground she hadn't even realized she'd grown into. The sun moved. The shadows stretched. A hawk screamed far off. She dozed, dreamless, then woke to the smell of rain. Not much. Just the kind that came in scattered threads, barely enough to wet the stone. But it cooled the air, turned the dust to clay. She sat up slowly and saw movement below, near the canyon floor. Hoofbeats. A single rider. The wind shifted. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You stubborn old man." Thomas Granger came into view as the last light of day caught the edges of his coat. Smoke snorted as they climbed the ridge, each step heavy, deliberate. He dismounted just below her ledge and didn't speak right away. "I thought you'd head north," he said at last. "Didn't expect to find you back in the ribs of this rock." "I didn't expect you to follow." He looked up at her. "You always run when people throw stones?" She stood, slowly. "When they come for people I care about, yes." "You care about me." She didn't answer. He took off his hat, slapped the dust from his leg, and started climbing. She watched in silence as he made his way up, step by careful step, until he stood just a few feet from her. He looked older in the canyon light, more tired, but there was still something steady in the way he stood. "I brought jerky and water," he said. "Didn't think you'd be eating cactus out here." She gestured to her pouch. "I have enough." He dropped the bag anyway. It landed with a dull thud. They stood without speaking for a while, the wind tugging at their clothes, the ravens above settling into their roosts. "I didn't want them to hurt you," she said. "They already have," he replied, "but not the way you think." She frowned. "I lost my boy," he said, his voice low. 15 years ago. Cholera took him in 3 days. Mary died 2 winters later. I buried them both. Then I sat on that porch for more than a decade, waiting to forget. Nita didn't move. "But then, you showed up," he said. And suddenly there was dirt to turn, fences to fix, a voice in the house again. "You didn't curse that place, you reminded it how to breathe." Her throat tightened. "I'm not yours," she said softly. "I never said you were. But that doesn't mean I'm letting you rot out here because some cowards couldn't stomach a birthmark." She turned her back to him. "They'll burn the ranch next time. Then we'll rebuild it. They'll come with guns," he shrugged. "So will I." She spun on him, eyes burning. "You're an old man, and I've lived more than enough years to spend a few of them doing something that matters." They stared at each other, the canyon wind whipping between them like a challenge. "You think I'm something special?" she asked. "I think you're the kind of rare that makes other people feel small. That's why they want you gone. I don't want to spend my life being hunted." "Then stop running," he said. It came out sharper than he meant, but he didn't take it back. She looked down at her feet. The earth below them was cracked, but flowers still bloomed between the stones. Desert blooms, stubborn, bright. "You can't fix people like them," she whispered. "No," he said, "but maybe we can outlast them." She looked up again. The wind quieted. The last of the sunlight bled red along the canyon wall. "I was going to stay here," she said. "Wait until no one remembered me." He smiled, a small, sad curve of his lips. "Too late for that." She didn't smile back. But she didn't look away either. They rode back together the next morning. She sat behind him on the saddle, her arms wrapped around his middle, her head resting lightly against his back. Smoke carried them steady through the waking desert. The ranch was still standing. No windows broken, no ash messages on the walls, just quiet. But the quiet was different now, heavy. That evening, as the sky burned orange, they sat on the porch steps, sharing dried apples and hot coffee. Nita traced a shape in the dust with a stick, circles inside circles. "They'll come again," she said. He nodded. "Then let them come." The days that followed were quiet, but tense. Nita kept to the edges of the property, eyes scanning the horizon. Thomas walked the fence lines with his rifle slung across his back. And then, on the 5th night, they came. Not in a crowd, just 3 men. On horseback. Lanterns held high, the same 2 that had whispered in the general store, plus 1 more. They stopped at the gate. Thomas stood with his rifle resting in his hands. Nita stood just behind him, not hiding. "You gonna let her go, Granger?" one of them called. "Or are we gonna have to take her?" Thomas said nothing. "She's cursed," another spat. "Marked. You don't see it. You're blind." Thomas raised the rifle, slowly, deliberately. "You have until I count to 5 to leave this land," he said. "After that, We'll let the desert decide." The men hesitated. Nita stepped forward, her face calm, her hands empty. Her voice low and sure. "Do I frighten you so much you need to bring lanterns into the dark?" The leader narrowed his eyes. "You don't belong here. This land doesn't belong to you." He spat. "You'll bring death." She stepped closer. "So will fear." Thomas's voice cut through the air. "One." The riders shifted. One muttered under his breath. Another looked back toward the road. "Two." The horses danced nervously. "Three." The men turned. The leader lingered a moment longer, eyes locked with Thomas. "This ain't over," he hissed. Thomas didn't blink. "Four." They rode off. The silence afterward was deeper than before. Nita exhaled. Thomas lowered the rifle. That night, Nita stood at the edge of the garden plot. The earth beneath her feet felt warm, alive. She knelt, placed her hands into the dirt, and whispered her grandmother's words. The wind stirred the corn sprouts. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel cursed. She felt powerful. The desert dawn rolled in soft and golden, stretching fingers of light across the fields like the hands of a forgiving God. The ranch, battered and weary though it was, stood as if it had never known fire or fury. Smoke dozed near the barn, tail twitching. A rooster crowed once and then gave up, his throat too tired or the morning too peaceful to bother. The world, for a few quiet moments, breathed easy. Nita stood barefoot at the edge of the garden plot. Dew clung to the first squash leaves, and a row of young corn blades swayed beneath her fingers. The dirt was warm beneath her toes, damp from the night's cooling air. She pressed her palm to the soil and closed her eyes. The old words rose again, soft and steady, like her grandmother's breath when she'd chant beneath the moon. "For every root you take, give thanks. For every seed you plant, give love." The wind stirred her braid as if to answer. Behind her, the door creaked open. Thomas shuffled out in his boots, holding 2 tin cups of coffee. He moved stiffly, like every joint had to be convinced to obey him. He handed her 1 cup without saying anything, and she took it in silence. They stood together under the widening sky, the kind of silence between them now no longer heavy or uncertain, but worn in like leather, familiar, comfortable. "You sleep?" he asked. "Some." "I didn't." She sipped her coffee and nodded. "Your bones talk too much." "My mind?" A faint smile touched her lips. "Tell it to be quiet." "Tried. It's stubborn. Gets that from me." They drank, the steam rising in thin ribbons between them. After breakfast, she returned to her herbs while Thomas walked the fence line. The men from town hadn't returned. Not yet. But both of them knew the kind of hatred didn't dissolve like morning mist. It waited, gathering like thunder behind the hills. Nita didn't waste her time worrying. Instead, she prepared. She hung charms made of bone and thread along the porch beams. She ground cedar bark and sage into a dust that she burned nightly. The smoke curling around the windows carried on soft chants. Not because she believed it would stop bullets, but because it steadied her hands. People fought with knives and fists, but the real battle, she knew, was the one they waged inside, the one between fear and faith. Thomas said little about it, but she caught him watching her sometimes. His eyes weren't full of doubt. They were full of something else, something deeper, like he was trying to remember what it meant to believe in something. By the 3rd day, word had spread. A wagon arrived just past noon, rattling down the old trail like it hadn't seen a horse in a year. A woman and her husband stepped down, their clothes dust-streaked, their hands nervous. Their daughter had taken sick, fever, shaking, skin flushed red. The doctor in town had no answers. Someone in town, no one would say who, had whispered about the girl with the owl's mark and her herbs. Nita saw the fear in their faces as they approached. She saw the way they couldn't quite meet her eyes. But she welcomed them anyway. She set the girl on a cot near the fire, placed cool cloths on her brow, and burned mountain balm in a dish beside her. She brewed a bitter root tea and fed it to her slowly, with whispers and quiet songs. Through the night she stayed by the girl's side, listening to her breathing, adjusting her wrappings, cooling her skin with leaves and oils her grandmother had taught her to mix. Thomas stood at the doorway most of the time, arms folded, rifle leaning against the frame. He never interfered, never asked, just watched. By morning, the girl's fever broke. The parents wept. They pressed coins into Nita's hands, too many, and she tried to give them back, but they insisted. "It's not for the herbs," the mother said. "It's for what you carry, that spirit." Nita said nothing. She just nodded, her throat tight. They left without another word, and the ranch was quiet again. But the next day, another came. Then another. A man with a broken arm. A child with a rash. An old woman too weak to walk. They came on foot, by wagon, by mule. Some brought food. Others brought tools or cloth, or nothing at all. And none of them called her cursed. Not anymore. Thomas said little about it. But Nita saw the change, in how he walked straighter, in how he whistled again when he worked, in how the porch never seemed as empty in the evenings anymore. One afternoon, he came in from the barn holding a tangle of wood and rusted wire. "Looks like the windmills finally had enough," he said. "Want help?" He paused. Always. They worked side by side for hours, her small hands steady, his rough ones firm. By sunset, the wheel spun again, creaking with purpose. They sat in the dirt afterward, drinking water from tin cups. "You've brought people back here," he said. "Life." She shook her head. "They were always looking for a place to go. I just didn't tell them no." He looked at her then, really looked. "You're not a girl anymore." She blinked. "What?" "You're a woman," he said. "And not just in age, in strength." She didn't answer. The words sat in her chest like warm coals. A week later, word came from the Apache Council. They'd heard of her. Heard of the white rancher who gave her shelter. Heard of the people she'd healed. They sent a message, an invitation, not to accuse, not to punish, but to hear her, to listen. She didn't sleep the night before. Thomas offered to come with her. She said no. This was hers to carry. She rode out before dawn, the trail still bathed in shadows. She wore her grandmother's necklace, carved bone and beads, and tied her hair with a strip of Thomas's old bandana. The council gathered near the river bend, beneath the high cliffs where owls nested. The elders sat in a circle, faces carved by time and sun. Others stood behind them, women, men, children. Nita stepped forward without trembling. She did not apologize. She spoke of her birthmark, of the way they had treated her, of the silence they had wrapped around her like a noose. She spoke of her grandmother, of healing, of the ranch, and the man who had treated her like more than a curse. She spoke of the people who now came not to fear her but to be healed. And she said this: "I was never the poison, only the mirror. What you feared was never me. It was what I reminded you of, the things you threw away, the power you buried." The wind was still when she finished. Then the elder woman who had once spat near her feet stood. She crossed the circle, and she placed a feather in Nita's hands, an owl feather. Blessing, forgiveness, acknowledgement. When Nita returned to the ranch, the sky was burning red. The children of the visitors were playing near the porch. Smoke was chasing a chicken across the yard. Thomas sat on the steps, watching the horizon. She didn't speak, just walked up beside him. He looked over. "Well?" "They listened." He nodded. She sat beside him, the feather still in her hand. "I'm staying," she said. "I know." They sat in the darkening light, the stars beginning to peek through the velvet sky. A breeze stirred the cottonwoods, and the garden rustled behind them. He reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. She opened it. A small carving. A horse. It was ugly. Lumpy. Its legs too thick. She smiled. "Still not very good," she said. He shrugged. "Tried. I like it." She held it tightly. Behind them the windmill turned. The barn stood straight. And above the corral gate she tied the owl feather. It fluttered there for years. And so, in the heart of the unforgiving desert, a girl once feared for her face became a woman revered for her spirit. The land that had once rejected her now whispered her name with reverence. And beside a lonely old rancher who once believed his story had ended, she began a new chapter, one rooted not in fear but in love, healing, and the kind of strength that only grows where others see ruin. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles, where the dust of the old frontier still carries tales of courage, compassion, and unexpected love. Join us for more unforgettable stories of the Wild West. You won't want to miss what's coming next.